So why don't I go ahead and start with our introductions, and then we'll move on to our program. So thank you everybody for coming, and you might be surprised to know it was snowing yet again today, and it was probably difficult to find parking. Snowbanks are abounding, but we're glad that you're here. My name is Maria Emanuel. I am the Associate Director of UNHInnovation, and thanks for coming to our seminar series. This year we've been focusing on innovating in New Hampshire innovation assistance, and today's topic is going to be about negotiations. And a reminder to stay with us afterwards. We're going to have a presentation, leave some time for a Q&A period. Stay with us afterwards for networking. We have some light appetizers, and just a reminder, as always, that you need to be 21 or older for our beverages, our adult beverages. I wanted to thank our sponsors for this year's seminar series. We have Finch & Maloney, which is a law firm providing intellectual property counseling and services to tech companies, and they're located in Manchester, New Hampshire. And our gold sponsor is Divine Millamant, a full-service legal firm also located in Manchester, New Hampshire. Our next month's seminar is going to be on March 26th. Hopefully not as much snow will greet us, but who knows? Maybe it'll just be mud piles at that point. And we'll be putting out some announcements soon about that topic and our invited speaker. And with that, I just want to move right on into our talk today. So Marc Sedam is our Associate Vice Provost for Innovation and New Ventures. It's a brand new title, and I didn't even have to look at my cheat sheet for that one. And he's going to talk to us today about negotiation tactics and techniques. And Marc has been steering the innovation ship at UNH for the UNH Innovation Office since 2006, and brings with us a track record both in private industry as well as in the tech transfer setting from the University of North Carolina. So with that, I know.
2010. You said 2006.
2010. I joined in 2006.
I was going to say. I felt like it was the "Here Comes the Bride" moment walking up the aisle. All right. This thing's live, right? All right, so we decided to take a little break from the kind of who's and what's of what's going on in the state. And this is actually a presentation, but a topic that I teach a lot. So I sit on the board of my professional organization, the Association for University Technology Managers. And in that role, I'm basically our lead trainer. So I'm the head of professional development. What that means is I get to go to some pretty interesting places and teach the concepts of what we're trying to drive in New Hampshire, but most universities are trying to drive all over. So this presentation has appeared in Spain and China. We'll go to Kuala Lumpur next month and Korea a couple times. And it's always an interesting topic because negotiation is such a cultural issue. So you think of, you could do this, you could do if you've ever been on an airplane and you open up, or you flip to the back and you see Chester Karras, the Chester Karras negotiator. You don't get what you want, you get what you negotiate. And that guy's been dead for 25 years and they still have the picture from 1972. But you take those negotiation courses, and what they don't tell you, it's an American negotiation course. It's about figuring out and sort of locking horns with the person. It's not necessarily combative, but it is based in the culture that you're in. And so when you do this somewhere else, and you talk about how some of the stuff I'll talk about, like how to set the stage, how to gain power in the discussion, it doesn't translate, literally or figuratively. Because if you tell someone that you're in, for example, in Korea, when you're very upfront about the details, and the person in front of you does not have the authority to execute the deal, they close down. Because they have to go get permission, and rather than have a discussion when they don't have the control, they simply don't. And so you think that you're in the middle of this discussion and you're setting the table, and the other person has already decided that they're not talking to you because they can't. Anyway, I want to give a little background because it is kind of fun to do this in other environments. This is not a professional negotiation discussion. This is a little bit of experience that I've had doing things, and some just basic principles. 45 minutes and then let's get to the beer. So the first general concept is to figure out who's doing it. This seems simple, right? Like, well, I'm talking to you, I'm the negotiator. But are you the decision maker? It's like I just said. So If you go into the room and you're having a discussion and you're the salesperson and you're trying to figure out what the number is that you're going to try to get from the other side, are you the end person? It's the classic, you go in and you try to buy a car and they always have to talk to the manager. There isn't really a manager. I think it's just a cardboard cutout of David Hasselhoff, and they say, can I do this? And they say, okay. But this perception of who is the decision maker and who's the authority. So figuring out who the decision maker is, how much authority you can give to the person having the discussion, and what the parameters are that you need to cover. The key principle of negotiation, and at the very end of this, we're going to talk a little about valuation because they're connected, is knowing what you want when you walk in the door. It's not a random walk to an agreed upon conclusion. It's actually a fairly specific set of constraints that you're trying to find your way to. When I negotiate either on behalf of or for startups or in a license negotiation, we spend a lot of energy putting together financial statements to know what the impacts are, and I'll go through why that's a good idea and a thing. And then the second thing is the last thing is to be creative. So there is a give and take. There's one form of negotiation called Brinksmanship, which I'll talk about in a second, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's this is the number, go away or accept it. That is a way of negotiating. That's a style. You can do that. Works like once with the same person, but it's possible to do it. And the goal in anything is really to figure out, I don't want to say win-win because I hate that term, but to figure out a result that gives each side some benefit. It could be larger on one side and smaller on the other, but figuring out what you need to do. And this is one of my favorite sayings is interests not positions, problems and not people. You get caught up in a discussion, and I'm sure if any of you have buying a car, buying a house, I'm not talking about like a license negotiation, but how many of you when you bought your house had the moment where you said, I can't believe they asked me for that. Those jerks. Because they went too far. And what you wind up doing is you reflexively focus on the person and you start putting all of your negative feelings on the person rather than figuring out, is there a need that's not being met? And it's amazing how much in a negotiation you don't hear someone ask you this question. What do you need? Almost never hear that. It's a really powerful phrase because you're actually opening up the door to the other person and saying, I'm trying to give you what you need, not what you want. Never ask somebody what they want, except your wife. But what you need. And finding the difference between wants and needs is in the end is kind of the goal. Despite the fact I said I don't like win-win, there it is. And can you really get it? You can, but in order to get there, you have to figure out at the start what this sort of business phrase of the Batna, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Meaning if you're going to go in and you're prepared to hit the brick wall, what happens if they let you? So if you're going to go and say, this is absolutely my final position, is it really your final position? If you back away from that and you say, well, actually, that's not my final position, this is my final position, well, guess what? You have no leverage anymore. This is true in salary negotiations. This is true in any negotiation. Getting a job, getting a title, is what happens if the other person calls your bluff? What do you do? And then you have to be, in figuring that out in advance, then you can figure out whether you can use brinksmanship, be creative, whether you just sort of lay it out on the table, because you know what you're going to do if the other person calls you on this particular offer. In any negotiation, you will leave stuff on the table. The other, probably for me, the biggest misconception about negotiating with somebody is you didn't get everything you wanted. Welcome to the club. You never get everything you want. And in fact, if you get everything you want, you probably screwed the other person a little bit. Because it's almost impossible to think of a discussion. Think about your personal relationships. If you have a disagreement with somebody and you get everything you want, do you think that other person is happy? Or did they just say, I can't do this anymore, fine, have what you want to deal with? So it's important to set up a discussion where you know what you want, You know what you have to have. And that there are going to be places where you just say, I'm going to give you something that I really would like, but I'm not going to get. And one of my other jokes is that, you know, a good negotiation or a good license is when everybody is equally unhappy. Because that way you know, you've made that other person a little sad, which is fine, because you've gotten something that they didn't necessarily want to give. You're also a little sad because you gave up something that you actually kind of wanted. And if you both walk away going, seems fair, you're probably in the right spot. Because if you leave and you think like, dude, I killed it, right? You won that round, but I spent the last 20 years doing licensing. It's not a one-round fight. So if you get everything you want in the first round, guess what happens the next time? They're going to get you back. And usually if there's a second round of a discussion, you don't have the leverage. So everything that you took away in the beginning that you maybe could get, they're going to get back and then some. In most license negotiations, when you have a renegotiating, it's about the stuff that I gave you in the beginning that I no longer want to give you. This is, again, it's true in, again, if you bought a house and you argue about money and you argue about the punch list, or you argue about money and you whittle that person down and you get the price you want, what happens with the punch list? You don't they're like, forget it. The basement is collapsing, that's your deal. You got all the money you wanted. I'm not giving you a single thing on anything else. Versus saying, well, you know what, I'll leave $2,000 on the table and I want a pretty exhaustive punch list. It just depends on the way that you approach the question. So in general, there are three types of negotiating. Brinksmanship, capitulation, which is actually a type of negotiating, and what everybody wants to talk about is the principled negotiation. And everything really makes sense. I mean, you can use each of these categories. Again, I'm married, capitulation, I'm excellent at. It's whatever my wife asked me for, it's fine. So brinksmanship is exactly what it sounds like. It's a threat. No more than this. Here it is. And it's walking away if you threaten to walk away if you don't get precisely what you want. Now, this is actually kind of a useful thing. If you're going through a normal negotiation and you hit that point of no return and you say, I'm done, there's nothing else I can give, it's okay. It's okay to sort of set the bar and say, this is all I have. But what happens when you use brinksmanship, car negotiating, it's a good place to go, is it leads to a theory called the prisoner's dilemma, which means you set your line in the sand, the other person sets their line in the sand, and you stare at each other. Also known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the nuclear concept of mutually assured destruction. The whole principle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was we were both going to threaten to blow the crap out of each other, and neither one of us did because we weren't sure if the other person was going to retaliate. And how the prisoner's dilemma works is, if you've ever seen A Beautiful Mind and Nash, it's this concept of the Nash equilibrium. So here's how it kind of rolls through. Now remember, you both have, the story goes, you have two prisoners, or two criminals, and the police catch them. They put them in separate rooms, and they give each person the same deal. If you tell us the truth, you go free. If you don't tell us the truth and we catch you, you're going to serve 3 years. So the way that it works is, so if prisoner A cooperates and prisoner B cooperates, you each get a year in prison. If prisoner A defects, meaning they give up the other person, so the two criminals say, we're not going to say anything. Prisoner A defects, gives up prisoner B, A goes free, B serves 3 years. The same is true in the opposite way. And if each person defects, if each person gives up the other person, you both get 2 years. So if you cooperate, you each get a year. If you each give each other person up, you each get 2 years. But if you cooperate and the other person gives you up, you serve 3. And they go free. So what happens? You wind up in the lower right quadrant almost all the time. Because the threat of not going free is stronger than cooperation. So basically you sit there and say, but if I just blame it on her, I go home. I should do that. The other person says, I don't know if I trust that other person. I don't know if they're going to hold their mouth shut, so they're going to give me up too. And so we both wind up paying 2 years. So the Nash equilibrium is kind of funny because in a Brinksmanship kind of situation, what winds up happening a lot of times is you both are worse off. And that's the point. Is that when you use that as a strategy, it becomes more important to you to do what you want to do than to cooperate, and both parties are worse off. And what's funny is you put this in front of, they've done hundreds of, probably thousands of studies on this. And this is what happens almost all the time. Because the risk of having to take all the weight is just too strong. So basically, they're not negotiating anymore. You're not agreeing to a principled discussion. You both give the other person up, and you both wind up in jail. And so the principle behind it is, or the concept behind it is, everybody makes the best decision they can, given what they know. So the best decision for you is to talk, because you go free, but only if the other person doesn't talk. So each person is motivated to talk, so each person is worse off. Well, it's kind of it's a fun theory. It actually has a lot of implications in game theory, which I'm not doing game theory in 45 minutes. So the second concept is capitulation, which is exactly what it says. It's the strategy of no strategy. You ask for it, fine, I move on. You can use this in some interesting ways. You can use it to, I'm going to be unkind, set a trap. So you give up exactly what somebody asks you for. Then maybe the next time when you really want something, you change your strategy. Or it could be that in the end, it just doesn't really matter to you. It matters to the other person, so you just give up. It's okay. So it's pretty simple. The last one is the principled negotiation, and that's probably what y'all thought I was going to talk about when I started, which is the concept of you're trying to get to that win-win. And you're trying to figure out what the other, in a principled negotiation, your goal is for both sides to be happy. And it follows the motto of first understand and then be understood. One of the mistakes that people make in a principled negotiation is not the first part. The entire goal is for somebody else to understand what you need. That's not it. If you don't try to guess what the other person needs and you only focus on your own needs, you wind up here. So the first step to a principled negotiation is to actually ask a bunch of questions and figure out what the needs of the other side are. So, a question. To win or get what you want in a negotiation, you can't answer. To get what you want in a negotiation, should you lead, meaning make the first offer? All right, so I have a couple students, they're not allowed to answer. Should you lead or should you follow? So, show of hands who says to get more of what you want in a negotiation, you should go first. You should make the first offer. How many people think you should follow? Okay, how many people have no idea and they're scared to answer? Okay, excellent. So, it's actually to go first. It's a concept called anchoring. It's great. I don't habitually read the Harvard Business Review or Harvard Business Week. It's a really good article. The principle of anchoring is that when you go first, you set the tone. You set the expectations. So let me give you an example of how it works. So Glenn and I are in a discussion and talking about a technology. Glenn's thinking the technologies he wants to pay $20,000, but he'd pay $30,000 if he had to. And I open up the discussion and say, Glenn, I've done my work and it's 100 grand. Now, what are you going to think? Besides, you're crazy and I'm not doing the deal, which might be it.
That I will never get it for 20.
That's right. That's exactly right. That by going first, I have already knocked him off his desire. So now we may not get a deal done, but you know 20's not happening, or the likelihood of 20 isn't happening. What it does psychologically is he starts to try to kind of come over to me already. Like 30 might have been, I don't want to do 30, but if I totally have to, I'm going to do it. And by my shooting so high, in the realm of reason, he may go right to 30 to see if 30 gets it done. So I've already knocked him off his balance of preparation. Now, there's an example that I had back at Carolina where I was working with a gene therapy company, and we did just that. I had a really interesting gene therapy vector, and we had a company, we'd worked with them before, thought it was good, gave him $100,000, and the guy chuckled. He's like, it's not happening. And I said, so what did you think? And he said, I was thinking 10. And I said, that's not happening. And his response was, cool, all right, well, call me with another technology someday. We hung up the phone. And it was over. And it's actually fine, because it turns out he was right. I never licensed it. But it's okay. We actually each stated our position, knew that we couldn't bridge the gap, and we went home. There's nothing wrong with that. But when I said 100 and he laughed, I'm like, I'm not getting 100. I wonder if this is going to happen, right? So, but we were so far off that we knew nothing was going to happen. The trick to this is that you can't be that far off. That effectively, I could have immediately capitulated and went to 30, but what's going to happen when I drop down to 30? He was like, it's going to be 10. Because you just went down $70,000 in 10 seconds. I'm going to get you the rest of the way. So I've lost a lot of my leverage. So part of negotiating is figuring out the value of what you have. And the last couple slides I'll go through is about valuation. And that's why valuation and negotiation are interrelated. You have to know for some rational place what the thing you have is worth in order to figure out how to go get it. So we talked a little bit about Batna. It's, again, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Again, that might be, I'll take whatever they offer me. It might be I do nothing. It might be I light the house on fire. It doesn't matter what it is, but you have to identify what that backup plan is going to be. Now, why does this matter? Because it's actually not about you, it's about them. So figure out, if you can guess what and I use the word opponent. I know this is for video, so I'm going to get killed for this. I use the word opponent with a lowercase o. This is not a combative situation. This is opponent is the person on the other side of the discussion from you. This isn't hand-to-hand combat. If you can guess your opponent's Batna, you're probably going to get a deal done. And so what does that mean? Let's say we have, again, I do the discussion with Glenn. I'm thinking 100, he's thinking 10. We realize that we're both a little overboard on our particular places, and we think we can get a deal done around $30,000 or $35,000. Now, I have to guess about Glenn. What happens if he doesn't get this deal? Does he not care because it's a large company and doesn't really matter? Or is the company really doing poorly and they need this technology to shore up what they're doing? So not getting a new technology is actually worse to them than doing a deal that they would rather not do. Figuring out whether the person on the other side actually has to have the deal that you're offering is really important. So I spent a lot of time in the pharmaceutical industry. I'm going to tell a really fun story. So maybe 5:20, Maria. So it's long enough. I think most of it's public. We might have to redact this from the video. So it's a really good story. So I was working at Carolina. I had this license that we licensed in like 1986. So this was 13, 14 years. We had just had this license. We got $25,000 a year for the license. And I get a letter over the transom from a pharmaceutical company. And they said, "Dear sir, we no longer want the license. It's terminated effective today. Thanks and have a good day." Okay. It's terminated. We send the letter confirming termination. And I call the professor who happened to have left the university and was somewhere else. And I said to her, "Okay, we got this termination letter. What do we do?" She says, "Oh, well, there's a group in Belgium that has always been really interested in my technology. Why don't you talk to them?" Great. So I set up a little technical brief. She sends me the contact person in the lab. I send them an email. Here's this technology has recently become available. We think that you're in the space. It was in, if you all have kids, it was an RSV vaccine, respiratory syncytial virus. If you don't have kids, every child in the United States pretty much has an RSV vaccine. So the market's pretty big. It's basically every child in America and most of the children in the rest of the world. I didn't have kids at the time, so I didn't appreciate how valuable it was, but be that as it may. So nothing happens. About 3 weeks later, I get an email from the same pharmaceutical company that terminated and said, to whom it may concern, our termination was an error. We're terribly sorry. We would like the license back. Here's a check for $25,000 for our annual fee. I went, I don't think so. So I basically responded and said, that's nice. Here's your check. I don't really know what I'm doing yet with the technology. So I started digging into what respiratory syncytial virus was and then realized how valuable it was. And I put together a pretty complicated spreadsheet that my valuation for the technology was about $4 million in today's dollars. So I wanted a license fee of $4 million. And I responded and said, thanks. We think the technology is worth a lot more. We'd like to enter a negotiation. And so it went back and forth, like, here's 25 grand, I would like more, here's 25 grand. They finally call me and say, and so I keep writing the company in Belgium saying, we're ready to license anytime you are. So the company that terminated finally calls and says, look, we licensed this already, and so we shouldn't have terminated the deal. Like, ha. So it turns out the lab in Belgium that I called was the sub-licensee. The drug was in phase 2 clinical trials, which is pretty far along. So imagine if you are the Belgian company who gets a letter from some knucklehead in North Carolina that says, how would you like to license the technology that you already have? Call me. Once we figured that out, guess who had the leverage? So I was ready to give this thing away, not give it away, but I was like, it's worth $4 million, it's a big pharma company, maybe 300,000 or whatever. As soon as I knew that they were done, I was like, wah, we're gonna make some money. And I called them on it. So I said, it comes to my attention that, they want this license. Why should I license it to you if you're just gonna give it to them? Their Batna was a big problem, was stopping a clinical trial. So they don't have an alternative discussion. They have to do this deal. So I eventually got $1 million for it. And I have a copy of the check in my office, and every time I'm sad, I open it up and I look at it. Ask Maria, she's seen it. I'm like, bad day, look, $1 million. So, but the point of the story was I knew that they didn't have an alternative to a solution. So then it was just about how much was I gonna go and get. I still let it go for 1/4 of what it was worth, basically because they called every 2 weeks and tried to get me fired. They called the chancellor of the university system and told them how irresponsible I was, and I shared them my spreadsheet, and they said, "Ooh, keep going." So, so you don't lose your job when you bring $1 million in. So, we talked about this, the concept of everybody walking away unhappily, but starting a negotiation, this is what I usually do. Put a list together. What do I need? What do I want? And what don't I care? So why create a list of things you don't care about? Because you don't know if the other person really cares about those things. It's really figuring out what you have to have, and then you don't know what the other person has to have. So I like creating a list of what I don't care about, because when we get in a discussion about it, I'll be like, all right, I guess I'll take a 60-day publication delay instead of 30. That's going to cost you. And really, we would do that most of the time anyway. But you give something away that doesn't matter to you, that's valuable to the other person. It's just like found money. So the list of don't cares is really kind of cool, because you wind up you can trade those things for stuff that you didn't even know people were willing to give up. I had done another deal, I can't give you the specifics because it's in clinical trials, but another deal where I offered to give up something that I would have done for free, and I got a $100,000 milestone payment out of it. It's like, well, there you go. So if you can figure out that list of don't cares with a list of their needs, you're probably going to do pretty well in the discussion. But the key to the whole thing is objectivity. So I advocate for something that a lot of people don't do, which is to give away all the information that you have. Because when you start a negotiation with somebody that you don't know, you don't trust them. Even if they're nice people, you don't trust them. So the way to build trust is to share. So one of the hardest things to do in a negotiation is to discuss a conversation, to have a conversation with someone who won't share with you the principles under which they're working. So it's just like it's always moving. I need this, or I need this, I don't need this. So I always advocate that your mom was right. You share. So we build a spreadsheet. We talk about stuff. If we get stuck, I hand them the spreadsheet. Here is my financial model. This is why I'm asking you for what you want. Why do you do that? Now you might think, you're losing all your leverage if you share what you have. I say no. I think what you gain is a level of trust, because you're saying to somebody, which is true, here's everything that I thought of before I got to this. Here are all of my assumptions. Now we're not about, Mark, you're bad, I'm good, or you're wrong and I'm right. We're talking about the assumptions. And once you start to talk about the assumptions, you get away from the people and into the problem. So you can have a discussion. I don't mind if somebody says, that assumption is crazy. The market, if you're thinking about, there's a couple students in the audience, the market size is, I'm going to get 5% of my market in 2 years, which, by the way, never happens, just in case. But somebody can say, well, no, it's not 5. When you say it's 5%, they say, well, no, it's more like 1%. Okay, well, let's adjust the model. We'll put 1% of the market, and let's see what the numbers work out with. It's not like the end of the world if your assumptions are wrong. It also, I had one instance where we were off by a lot. We were off by like $70,000 in the upfront fee. And the person on the other side kept saying, yeah, I just don't see it. I don't see it. I don't know what you're thinking. And I gave him the spreadsheet. And I always set mine up, but the assumptions are on the first page. So we set up a discussion. Here's my spreadsheet. We're going to talk about it. And he calls back, pick up the phone. He says, yeah, it's a pretty good spreadsheet. Yeah, he says, your assumptions are pretty much right on. Like the market was right, the margin was right, the growth rate was right. And I said, yeah, what does that mean? He goes, yeah, we'll do your deal. It's fine. Like he basically said, you guessed right. These are good numbers. I can't argue. Since the numbers are right, then what you're asking me for is inherently right. They have the money. And he said, this is fine. Yeah, if you want to do $70,000, that's fine. Because you gave me a reasonable assumption of why you should get that amount of money. So the discussion was over in 30 seconds. I didn't know what to do. I'm like, what else do you want? So you get some unintended benefits from that. The last piece about sharing is to tell somebody if the deal's going south. And a lot of people don't do it. They just don't walk away or they don't call back. Like I tell people, if we can't do this, I can't get this done. Like, I have to walk away. There's nothing I can do. I'm really sorry. So in some ways, it's a little bit of Brinksmanship thrown in there. But just that open discussion of, this is real, I can't do this deal, you find you get a little bit of flexibility. Another thing you hear about a lot, or you've been accused of, which hopefully none of you have, I have been accused of, is bad faith negotiation. So bad faith actually means something. It's not just somebody calling you mean names. It's actually sort of I won't say it's a legal term, but it's a term of law, which means that you entered into the discussion based on falsehoods. So you weren't negotiating in good faith. You were lying to them. That's what they're really saying. If somebody says, this seems like a bad faith negotiation, what they're saying is, I think you are a big smelly liar. And that's a bad thing for a couple of reasons. One is to try to get another deal. It's probably not going to happen. But some people use that as a way to get you to cave, which is another reason why sharing the assumptions is really important. So if somebody says, you're negotiating in bad faith, and I've had a handful of people accuse me of that over the years, I'll say, well, here's my spreadsheet. I may be badly negotiating, but I did it based on a set of principles which you can agree or disagree with. And that usually goes away. But it's a bad thing. So a lot of times you enter into a discussion, and at universities we're famous for this. Like, we don't think we have any leverage. We're just a university, it's a big company, they have lots of money, we have no money, we would like money. How are we going to possibly have this discussion when we have none of the cards? And the trick is really to figure out how to win back some power in that discussion. Because the truth is that most companies don't actually look at it that way. Most companies will look, this is specifically for the university environment, although I will say it's also the same for large company, small company. You know, they're not in a discussion because they think that you're worthless. So when you enter the discussion basically laying down already, you're giving up stuff that you might not have to give up. So the trick is to try to find a way to get the perception of power. The perception of power might be something as simple as, I've called 3 people about this, and I'm talking to you, but I've got 3 other phone calls in. Now, is it on this slide? Yes. Creative use of language is encouraged. Don't lie, but a creative use of language is part of the game. So I might have made 3 phone calls and not talked to anybody. Now, I won't say I have 3 other people interested in this deal, but I will say I called 3 other people, and I'm waiting to hear back, and let's have this discussion. That's absolutely true, but it's trying to build some level of power back into the deal. Again, buying a house. Well, I'm looking at another house. Well, if that person has 4 other people looking at their house, you probably don't get anything back. If you're the first person that walked through the door in the last 3 months and you say, I'm looking at 2 houses, even if you don't like the other house, you might find some interesting ways of what you're going to get back. We talked about wants and haves, and though I've given examples of ways to, I'm not even going to call them half-truths, is framing the discussion in a way that's advantageous for you. Saying I called 3 people is not the same as saying I have 3 people negotiating. So it's not true. It's not untrue. And those are little bits ways that you can find to pull some of the power back in the discussion, even if it's just to let the other person know that you're out there having other conversations. Again, I try to bring this back to things you might have experienced in sort of day-to-day stuff, whether it's buying a car. Well, I went to the other Honda dealer and they're going to give me a better deal, or they're throwing in the brake pads or the undercoat. So just letting people know that you have options can be really useful. But in the end, information is really the thing that matters. You can do that a little bit just to gain your footing so that you don't feel like you're walking in the door already saying, well, I know you're going to roll me, so let's just get this over with. Information is really the key. So in a negotiation, you have to understand what something is worth. And we're going to get very quickly into valuation a little bit. But the two main places are experience, which is I've done this a lot and here's what I know. And related to that is comps. So what is like your thing? What is close enough to your thing that you can make an analogy to the thing that you want to do? They don't have to be perfect, but they have to be similar. Here's an example. I mean, in a business, I know there are a couple students in the audience. How many people are students? 3? Just the 3 of you, or 2.5 of you? A couple, all right. So when a lot of students here's a little hint for the Holloway competition or anything else is, somebody will say, what else is in your space? You'll say, I have no competition. That has never happened in the world. So there is competition to everything. It may be as simple as the comparable. What's a comparable for Coca-Cola? Pepsi. What else? Bottled water. What else? You're still in sodas. What about beer? Yeah. It's a comp. It's not the same product. And that's what a lot of people do is like, what's similar to Coke? Pepsi. You think fizzy carbonated dark drinks. But coffee, water, beer, they're all comps because it's a drink. And it depends on how you define the pool that you're playing in. Now, if you said, what is a comparable for soda in the soda market, or Coca-Cola in the carbonated sugared beverage market, well, now we're into Dr. Pepper and Sprite and all those things. But I didn't say that. It's a drink. So it can be anything that you can drink and not die, obviously. So a lot of times the folks that are the technologists in this are really the people that help and hinder in the beginning at the same time, because the technologist really focuses in on the thing that they have. And I've talked to a lot of faculty over the years, and they'll say, well, nobody's doing this. That's true, but there are people in analogous fields. And so the trick is to figure out how wide of a net do you want to cast? How broadly do you want to define yourself versus other people? Real world example of that, does anyone know what Coca-Cola's most recent product that they released is?
Free.
What's that?
The free, Coca-Cola free with no.
Nope, newer than that, but that one's, yeah, with stevia?
Water?
Nope, they have that already, it's Dasani.
Milk.
Milk. See, so you, I heard an ew. Like, no, but Coca-Cola's newest product is milk. It's not milk and Coca-Cola. They released I can't remember what the name of the brand is, but they released this new milk. Not that milk, but milk can be new, because they have a process where they increase the protein content of the milk. And they increase the dietary fiber content of the milk through processing. So they don't do anything, they just filter it in a certain way and increases the protein content. So Coca-Cola viewed the way to extend their beverage dominance is milk. Because no one's introduced a new milk since they went to lactose-free milk.
It's caffeine-free.
It is caffeine-free milk. So it really is about how you define the box that you're in. Coca-Cola obviously does not define itself by fizzy carbonated dark beverages. They look at them as whatever you want to drink, they want to sell you. If they get to beer, though, that might be a bridge too far. So figuring out what the comps are important too is like, again, we talked about what do you compare to? How do you compare it? In other words, is it a displacement of a product or is it an additive? If we'll use the Coca-Cola milk. For some people, milk might displace Coca-Cola, meaning I'm overweight, I drink soda, I shouldn't drink soda, I should drink healthier, I'm going to drink milk. So I'm not going to drink Coca-Cola, I'm going to drink milk. Milk displaces Coke in that product category. For other people, it's additive or extensive. So use Coca-Cola free is a good example. So there's Coke, then they did New Coke, and that didn't work out so well. But then there's Diet Coke, and then they came into this Coke free, which is with stevia, right?
No, corn syrup, I think.
Oh, okay. And then there's another one. It's got a green label that I know has stevia. Life. There you go. So they've said here's a new product. So they've added one product that has was a cane sugar, right? So it's basically like they've rebranded what we used to call Mexican Coke because they made Coke in Mexico with cane sugar. Now they have one with a different sweetener. So they're extending their brand out. So they're actually competing with themselves, figuring out how you define yourself with respect to other people. And then once you figure out where you are, you have to figure out the weaknesses of what else is out there. So how much do you know? In a technology basis, and for folks thinking about a startup, there are a couple of really great sites to look at to find. There's an amazing amount of information about your competition. One is Recap is a paid thing, it's recombinant capital. But the SEC filings are an awesome place to look for other people's information that they don't want to share. If you look in the 10Ks and 10Qs of a company's quarterly filings, you will find everything that they're doing. I've even found license agreements with competing universities in those 10Qs because they have to disclose if it's material enough. I found royalty rates. I found growth. You could find if a company is struggling or not. So when you think about who you're trying to compete to, the SEC database is actually a really good place to gather a lot of competitive information and then positioning yourself for a better negotiation. Then you have comps, and then you have rules of thumb. And the question always is, whose thumb, right? So my rule of thumb is different than your rule of thumb. A good example of a rule of thumb was called the 25% rule. And the 25% rule said that in a partnership agreement, the technology holder or the licensee, the person that had the technology that was being acquired or licensed, should receive 25% of the value of the eventual sale. So if a product sold for $4, the person who created the product should get $1. It was a rule of thumb. It actually was a rule of thumb that went all the way up to the Supreme Court because there was a license litigation about the value of a technology, and the Supreme Court last year threw it out. And that's the problem with rules of thumb is everybody used it, and the funny part is the 25% rule was based on a 1956 study of negotiation for 18 companies in a single industry. And it wound up being applied for 55 years in every other industry. Everyone's like, it's the 25% rule. Of course it is, let's continue. But it wasn't really based on things in those particular industries. So the Supreme Court wound up tossing it as a way of remunerating. So it doesn't exist anymore. So So what industry does, or what your competitor probably does in a negotiation, is they do financial modeling, and that's where valuation comes into. So, yep. So you're looking at estimating market, estimating penetration rates. This is the difference between the total market size and the total addressable market. Nobody cares what the market size is. I mean, the market size for many products is very large, but the total addressable market is what you think you can capture. So in the example of the vaccine that I gave you before, the total market size might be 300 million people. So let's say it's 3 million babies every year, 1%. I don't know what the birth rates are of the country. So let's say it's 500,000 babies a year. The total addressable market is 500,000 babies, because every baby's probably going to get that vaccine. For other things, except for the people that don't believe in vaccines, but I'm not going there. But other products, the total market size might be, Durham, but it's only the students that want to buy that product. So the addressable market might be several orders of magnitude below. Place where people get in trouble is they conflate the total market size with the total addressable market, and you sort of overinflate the potential valuation of what you have. There are a couple of financial tools which I'll talk about real quick. Discounted cash flow and net present value, about figuring out how to model these things. But then in the end, you just have to figure out what you're trying to accomplish. I want to speed up a little bit so we get to the end. Lastly, on just the philosophy behind negotiation is really to define what you have with respect to the market. Is it new? And if it's new, and this is, again, you're trying to get somebody else to buy into you. Define what makes it unique. Define how much better it is than something else. Where is it? Is it an idea, or is it an actual product that you can buy today? Because the value of those things is very different. If you can guess costs, that's the hardest thing to do, but there's actually databases you can look at for costs. And you find, you figure out the competitive landscape, and you figure out what the potential is. Something new is usually the best, the thing that becomes in a negotiation the most profitable. The second would be something that is just an improvement. So there's a bunch of other things. This makes it 5% better. Now you start thinking about, well, who owns the thing that you're improving on? Is it, does anyone own milk versus protein enhanced milk? Well, nobody owns milk, so fine. Protein enhanced milk is better. But other examples of improvements are somebody uses a technology in a different way. A very funny example of that is puppy Prozac. So we all know Prozac. It's an anti-anxiety drug. Guy in California had a very hyperactive dog who every time he left, he would eat the door and the couch and everything else and tear up the house. He had anxiety disorders, so one day he couldn't take it anymore, and he flicked the pill in the dog's mouth. Dog didn't chew anything up. Filed a patent on the use of Prozac to cure anxiety disorders in dogs. Got a patent. So he now had a new improvement or a use on Prozac, but he didn't own Prozac. So wound up having to license that to Pfizer for $10 million. But not bad for a hyperactive dog. It paid for a lot of couches. So, but knowing that you can't do anything with that idea without the owner of the original idea. By itself, it's worthless because you need Prozac. And if you don't have Prozac, then you can't authorize the use in animals. So you have to have both. We'll go to the next one. We talk about new uses. They are rare. Taxol, Prozac, the other use, so I gave the example one slide ahead, I apologize. The other example that's very new is thalidomide. Well, a couple people went, I saw the faces like, people are using thalidomide? What the hell? That was the 60s when they gave it for anxiety or queasiness, and they had the flipper babies, and people came out without arms and legs. Well, thalidomide turns out to be a very potent cancer therapy. And I'm blanking on the company that brought it forward, but they basically now, so they're selling thalidomide now to treat cancer and a couple of other pretty nasty diseases, but they have a methodology, which was patented, of monitoring people and ensuring that, and so they're testing fertility, they're testing sperm, they're testing people to make sure that they're not pregnant. And so so basically thalidomide's an awesome drug unless you want to reproduce. And if you want to reproduce, it's the most awful drug that's ever been developed. So once you can separate those things and you're not in an area where that's reproductive. So the first use of thalidomide when they brought it back to the market was in patients over 65. Likely not to reproduce, though we've heard stories. So I'm going to try to wrap up real quick. The last piece of the technology stuff is, and I advocate the use of the business model canvas, is just figuring out the value proposition. And in the end, the negotiation is about what do you have, what is it worth, what is it worth to the other person, what is their choice if they don't use you, and if you can figure out those things, normally you get a pretty decent deal. So I want to wrap up with about 3 minutes on valuation, because you can spend, and I do a day-long thing on valuation. I find it fun. There's beer, we're not doing it. So in a perfect world, the valuation of a business, of a technology, of an idea is this. It's the Black-Scholes equation. Nobel Prize winning idea. It created the options market, the reason that you can trade options, and the reason that you have a lot of the good and bad things about the creativity in the financial market is due to this equation. You can blame Myron Scholes for that. But realistically, this is an algorithm for determining the value of a product that you have in front of you today. Now, in practice, that doesn't work. In practice, valuation is something between a spreadsheet and a dartboard. Because there's so many unknowns. And the trick to this whole thing was, how many knowns can you create? How can you dig up information that you didn't otherwise have? So if you can use Excel, the concept of net present value is very simple, but also something people don't think about. Again, I'll do a 30-second story from another experience I had. Faculty member, different campus, not anyone you know, had developed a dopamine agonist to treat Parkinson's, and went into a discussion with a venture capitalist that I knew, and went through this enormous spreadsheet about how the market size was. You know, drug takes 13 years to get to market. Patent life is 20 years. And the guy asks him, okay, how much do you think this technology is worth? And the faculty said, well, I'm being very conservative, but it's worth $64 million. And he was serious. My friend closes his book and says, thank you, I'm done. What he had done was figured out what the value of the $3 billion was in sales, and what he was willing to give up in order to give up that $3 billion, knowing full well he couldn't get there. Had he done net present value, it would have come down to a number that was closer to 8 million, but we'll get to why that number wasn't even any good. Anyway, it's a very simple equation in Excel. You basically project out what you think you're going to earn every year. You highlight those cells and you give it a risk rate, and it'll say it's worth this today. So $10,000 3 years from now is not worth $10,000. It's worth what it's going to cost you to get $10,000 3 years from now. Depending on your risk rate, it can be worth anything from $1 to $3,000 or $4,000. The discounted cash flow adjusts for risk. So you're saying, why are you talking about risk? This is getting really boring. Because it's the difference between the value of a technology in an early stage startup company or a university and the value of a technology from a big company like a Pfizer. So these are also knowns. So how do you guess the risk rate? You can actually go to Yahoo Finance and look for alpha. Look for the risk rate of companies. So this is loosely put. If you are a publicly traded company, your risk rate is the value of your bonds, the coupon rate on your bonds that is published in the back page of the Wall Street Journal. That's the cost of money that you can acquire. If you're a late stage company, 15%, 25%, so on. Startup companies, basically it's infinite for the most part. And one of the things when you're doing financial modeling is it's not worth going out 10 or 15 or 20 years on your financial model. And the reason why is these numbers. At about 40% of a risk rate, all money greater than 3 years from now is worth nothing. Now, the reality is the venture capitalists don't want to read anything more than 3 columns deep, so that's why they don't want to see your spreadsheet far out from years 4 to 10. But in practice, it's those dollars, whatever you think they are. You could have $1 trillion with a 40 or 50 or 60% discount rate. It's probably worth $100. So it doesn't make any sense. Just figure 3 years. So in the end, valuation is what do you have with based on diligence and what is it worth? And in the end, it's worth what the market will bear. And that's why negotiation and valuation are so tightly aligned with each other, is because you can guess what you think it's worth, but you're only going to know when somebody actually writes you a check. So to put a final note in this, we have the final slide, venture capital valuation. How much money do you want? I want this much of your company, and divide those two numbers together, and you get the value of your company. You want $1 million, they want 50%, your company is worth $2 million. You can build all the spreadsheets you want, that's the value of the company. So it really has come to, you could build these spreadsheets up in a startup mode, but it's really what somebody wants to give you and how much of the company they want to get. So I go back to that story that I told you. Now when my faculty colleague said it was worth $64 million, we had the discussion was over, and the venture capitalist looked at me and said, Mark, what's it worth? It's like $3 million. He said, yes, it's worth $3 million. Why was it worth $3 million? Because the last 5 deals in that therapeutic area in the previous 18 months were at a pre-money valuation of $3 million. That's the only answer. Because every other deal was worth $3 million, your deal is worth $3 million. Unless you can prove that it's so much more awesome than anything else, and the reality is that early in a pharmaceutical, you can't. So the negotiation was very simple. It was acknowledging what the market was, acknowledging what the valuation was, and either agreeing or disagreeing with that amount. Now you could dial in on the margins, and maybe it's 3.2 million, or maybe you give up 45% instead of 50% of the company. But that's pretty much it. Okay, so under an hour, which was my point, it was actually 51 minutes. Happy to do questions, happy to do formal or informal questions, so yeah.
Slightly off message, but I was on a phone call the other day with a startup and a small business. And the small business was advising the startup that when you deal with a behemoth, you deal with a big company, and you're talking about a licensing agreement, they're so big, at some point they can just say, you know, we're not paying, sue us, it'll never happen. So you're talking about getting money up front.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a reasonable approach in that situation, or where does that fit on the scale of paranoid to actual risk? No,
you should be able to, I mean, it depends on the market, but you should be able to get some money up front if it's worth anything to them. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing, is if they say sue me, it means you're asking too much money. That's how I look at that. But I mean, I've never done for a technology of any substance where there wasn't compensation exchanged up front. I would trade it for milestone payments or money farther down the line or sponsored research or something. And that's something, again, we could do this for like 4 hours, but another way that I look at the valuation is I figure out how much I think something is worth and then figure out how many ways you can split that pie. So cash today might not be the most important thing to you. It might be, I'd like $500,000 a year from now. Give me that. So sometimes I'll split that upfront fee into different sets of value and then recoup it over time if it's a problem. And a lot of times, sometimes I'll ask somebody if we're not doing the upfront fee. Maria's heard me say this before. I'll say, well, what's your purchasing power? How much are you authorized to sign for? Sometimes they are not authorized to sign for anything, and that's the excuse for not giving any money. And they'll say, well, nothing, I have to bring it to my boss. What's your boss authorized to sign for? Usually a director in a big company usually can do $25,000. And so that's part of it is, remember the very first slide was who's negotiating? So if you're in a small company or a big company and you want 100 grand and you're talking to the business development manager, you're gonna be there a long time because that person has no authority to give you that deal. You're gonna wind up in the VP of research at one point or another, and you might as well get there sooner than later. Yeah?
There was a bullet point on the bad faith, good faith. And at the bottom it said, they say both are negotiating in good faith, watch out, or something like that. But I'm not sure if you elaborated on that.
Let me roll back.
Often signal they're not.
Oh, it should say one party is negotiating in bad faith. In bad faith. I screwed it up. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I see what. No. What I meant was when somebody questions whether you're both negotiating in good faith. So what they're saying is like, are we having a good faith negotiation? What they're really saying is you're a big stinky liar. But I don't want to use the other word because that means something. I'm elevating the conversation. Sorry, that's poorly written.
So if someone questions.
Yes, questions whether you are, if we're both negotiating in good faith. They're just one conversation away from saying the other thing. So, sorry about that. Cool, beer and snacks. Thank y'all.